Hey everyone! So in this video today, I'm going to go over how to properly integrate sources into your paper. So for this upcoming essay, the last one, the argumentative essay, you can use sources, but it's totally optional, right? As you probably noticed in the evidence lecture video and in the argument chapter, you can include evidence that is not from a source, right? It could be like you go out and you do your own poll or survey or interview, right? Or use personal experience, use narration, right? Or use examples. So if you want to use sources in this last essay, you totally can. If you don't want to, it's optional, right? So you can just use the strategies, right? So it'll be up to you, but this is kind of like a good little crash course on how to integrate sources using MLA style. So I'm not going over everything, but I'm going over like just the basics, just enough for you to be able to properly cite your sources in your paper if you choose to use them. So why is source integration so important? In any academic writing, properly integrating sources using the documentation style that the course requires or like the field requires is very important, because you properly integrating your sources builds your own credibility as a writer, because the reader sees that and they'll be like, okay, this writer is giving credit where credit is due. They show a clear understanding of what the source is saying, right? So that's why source integration becomes really important. So when you do use sources beyond this course, right, instructors usually look for certain things. The first one is an indication that you understood what you read. So sometimes I do see like quotes from a source being used, but it doesn't actually say what the writer thinks that source was saying. They misunderstood what that source was saying. So it showed that the writer did not understand it, right? So that's one thing. You have to actually understand what the source is saying in order for you to use it properly. We also look for a clear reference to the source that you're using, right? So always citing properly. And of course, we look for a distinction between what you say versus what a source says, right? Because what a source says is not, it's not your words, it's not your idea. So we're looking for, it's okay to use other people's ideas, but we're looking for that clear distinction that, hey, this is what they say and this is what I have to say. So when it comes to things that are common knowledge, you don't need a source. So what do I mean by common knowledge? Usually, it's information that other people usually know or are expected to know. So, like for example, Guam is located in the Pacific Ocean and is part of the Mariana Islands, right? That's common knowledge. The year that World War II ended, that's common knowledge. So those things you do not need to find a source, right? But if you're still unsure whether or not something is common knowledge, you can ask yourself these two questions. So one, did I know this information beforehand? Or did this information or idea come from my own brain? If you answer no to both or either one of these questions, then you might need to find a source to back up what you're saying. So what does MLA style even mean? You probably saw in the syllabus and in the essay guidelines that I always put out that I require MLA style. So MLA style is just a documentation style. So what that means that in every field or discipline, there's a certain documentation style that they use so that people in that field can easily like find a source or a reference, right? So it's uniform in its formatting and how you reference or cite sources. So in the humanities, which is like English, literature, or even philosophy, they use MLA style, right? That's the most common style that they use. In like the sciences, they use APA style. But I will tell you this, if you can master one style, like MLA style, and you understand what the documentation style is all about, it's very easy to switch to APA style, Chicago style. So here are some MLA style formatting basics, which most of you are already following, right? You looked at the example in the syllabus and you followed that formatting. So you have 1-inch margins all around the paper. You use a 12-point Times New Roman font. I believe Arial font is also okay. And then double spaced lines, a centered title. You have the last name, page number in the top right corner of every page. And if you use sources, you must have all your sources that you used, that you cited in the paper, on a separate page, which is going to be the last page of your essay, and it's called a works cited page. So here's an example of the formatting basics, right? A similar example is also in the syllabus, but this is what the first page, the top part of the first page, would normally look like. So when you use any information, words, or ideas from a source, right, you must cite it properly. Okay, we call these in-text citations. So for this course, your in-text citations must all be in MLA style. So whenever you do a paraphrase, summary, or a quote, okay, you need to include an in-text citation. So this is very important because you're giving credit where it's due. Right? And then also the in-text citation helps readers understand where they can locate the source on the reference page or the works cited page. So we normally call these in-text citations parentheticals because the citation is usually within a parentheses. Okay, so usually you put this parenthetical after a quote or whenever the information ends, where like that information from the source, let's say it's like 3 sentences long, then you put it at the end of that last sentence. Inside the parenthetical, typically we include the author's last names and the page number of the source. So here are some examples. So in MLA style, if you have one author, you put the last name only, so Cruz, and then the page number 15. There's no punctuation in between, it's just a space. If it's two authors, you put both their last names and then the page number. So you might be wondering, okay, but what about works that have like 5 authors and things like that? But even with the 2 authors, whose name do I put first? So whenever you look at a book or an article, usually there's an author that's listed first. That's the one you put first. So you put their last name first. If you have 3 or more authors, again, choose the first author listed, put their last name, and then you would put et dot space al and then the space and page number. So et al. So here's a short paragraph in which a quote, paraphrase, and summary is being used. Now I want you to read it, and I want you to figure out if you can spot where the quote is, where the paraphrase is, and where the summary is. So if you said, hey, the quote is where the orange line is because there's quotation marks, you're correct. If you said where the yellow line is a paraphrase, you're correct. And if you said where the blue line is a summary, you're correct. So what's the difference between the three? Quotation, a quote, is a direct copy and paste of what a source or someone else said, right? And then therefore you put it in quotation marks to show that, okay, this is exactly what they said. You're just copying and pasting. A paraphrase, we call it an indirect quotation because it is not a direct quotation where you're copying and pasting, but let's say you want to paraphrase a sentence from a source, right? You have to paraphrase that sentence, put it in your own words completely, right? The key thing though is you keep the idea of that quotation or the essence of that quotation the same. So you cannot misrepresent or miswrite what that other person said. You have to keep the same idea. So paraphrases are a little bit more difficult in that sense. So with the paraphrase, again, it has to be completely in your own words. Sometimes you even have to change the sentence structure, but the idea has to remain the same. A summary is you can take a huge work, right, like 100 pages or something, and you basically talk about it in a nutshell, right, and just briefly explain the main point of that work. And that is a summary. So there are some things I'd like you to note from this. So in the quote, before the quote, we have basically like this introductory element. We're introducing who said it, right, and who they are. So Lena Torres, she's a small business expert, right? We call this an introductory element or a framing technique. So think of it this way, whenever you use a source, you use information from a source, you need like a picture frame around it. You need things that go around it, right? And that's called the introductory elements. Sometimes you have to give the year of when that source said it or when that source was published. It really depends. The year is important for, let's say, like you are using quantitative data, right? So numbers based data, because the reader kind of wants to know, are these statistics up to date, right? And in general, we consider sources 5 years or older to be outdated, but it depends. So if it's like number data or statistics, I would say a lot of that becomes outdated within that 5 years, or I'm sorry, after those 5 years. But let's say you are quoting like a theory from like a sociologist from like 3 decades ago or 80 years ago, those sources are okay. So it just really depends on the kind of source you're using and the information you're getting as to whether or not it's outdated. And then if you look at the paraphrase as well, right, it says it was a study conducted in 2022 by Urban Retail Alliance. So notice I have the picture frame there. I talked about who did the study and when it was conducted. And the year is also important here because whenever you do like a study, right, the timing is relevant because it could be very outdated. If this said 1999, it's like, okay, but is this information still relevant today? It might not be, right? So the more up to date it is for things like studies as well, right, the more convincing that evidence is. And then notice in the summary, right, I still have the introductory elements or the framing. I have the year. I state that it's a report, from what agency it is, and in what journal. So again, when you're referencing source material in text, there's different framing aspects or introductory elements that you will need, right, with around that source. So framing just means that you're properly introducing and sometimes qualifying the source. So what does qualifying mean? Qualifying means like, because if I said, oh, John Smith said blah blah blah, are you gonna be convinced by that, right? But if I said long time a long-time business expert who's owned 40 successful businesses, John Smith says, right? Then I qualified him. I gave his credentials, right? I talked about why what he has to say is very important and we should listen to it, right? So that's what qualifying is. But a good rule to know is paraphrases, you don't always need the introductory element, but quotes and summaries, you must always have that frame, that picture frame. So let's look a little bit more closely at framing and citing and just specifically on quotes. So again, like I said, all quotes, you need that picture frame. If your framing device or frame already has the author's name, again, you don't need the last name and the parenthetical. You just need the page number. So here I say Cruz says, locals supporting other locals can help sustain our island community and boost small businesses. And so I just have the page number because I already said Cruz. And if I don't have the name of the author in that sentence, I will put it in the parenthetical. And of course, always try to qualify that source. It could be their credentials, any educational affiliations, organizational affiliations, just to establish that they're a credible source. Just like if you're scrolling on Facebook or Pinterest, just because someone says something like, "Oh, you should eat 10 kiwis a day," you're not going to be like, oh yeah, I'll totally do that. You'd probably want to look more deeply into it and see who's saying it and why you should trust them, right? So here's an example. In the example, notice I say that he is a environmental biologist, so he is qualified to speak about this issue, right? And I also state the year, right? It's a study, so 2023, the year becomes important. And then I have the page number. But if the source has no page number, like it's an online article or like an online interview, you don't need to put the page number in the parentheses, but you still need the picture frame. So I'm going to say the speaker author's name, qualify them. In this case, Maya Chen, she's a food systems journalist and senior contributor, okay, at Green Table News. But let's say you go out and you interview someone for this essay, which I highly encourage, right? To go out there and speak to people, maybe get some good quotes from them, right? Especially experts in that field um, that you're writing about. So if it's someone you interviewed personally, you have to still have the picture frame, but also mention that it was a personal interview, right? And so give the person's name, why they're qualified to speak on this, and state that it was a personal interview or like a presentation or conference. So paraphrases. So remember, paraphrases, you don't always need the picture frame or introductory elements. But the same rules apply just like the quotes. If you have the author's name in the sentence, you don't need it in the parenthetical, you just need the page number. And again, if you do have, you don't have the author's name in the sentence, put it in the parenthetical. And of course, all summaries need that picture frame or introductory elements. Author's names, where the source came from, okay, what type of source it is, maybe the year if that's relevant, the title of the source. So you'll need all those things for the summary. And the same rules apply. Let's say it's like an entire online article that you're summarizing. Of course, there's no page numbers. But let's say you want to summarize just a chapter, like let's say from our textbook. You put the page numbers because you're not summarizing the whole textbook, but you are summarizing a certain amount of page numbers. So the works cited page, this one becomes a little difficult to format, and with documentation styles, they are very strict with how you format things. So for me, I'm not going to penalize you if the formatting is like off, right? To me, it's not a really big deal as long as the writer has made an effort to point out, like, hey, this is where I got the information from, right? And here's the information for that source. But I will tell you this, when I was a student, I had a class where I got one little thing in the works cited page wrong in one of my citations, and the professor took a whole 10% off the top of my grade for that paper. So for me, it's okay, but don't take that same mindset into other classes. Right? If they are requiring you to do it that specific way, right? I would do that, right? So the works cited page, it goes on a separate page after your paper. So it has to be on its own page. So you're going to have to insert a page break after the contents of your essay. I show you how to do a page break in one of the Moodle announcements. I posted a short video on formatting, so it's there. Each citation should have a hanging indent. So I'll show you what that looks like in the sample, and I think I'm going to post a short video on how to do that. And then the sources on that works cited page, they have to be alphabetically organized by a last name. If there is no author name, right, from a source, like let's say it's like the US government or Department of Labor or some kind of organization, you put the organization or agency's name. The title works cited should be at the top of the page and centered. And of course, everything should be double spaced throughout the whole paper. So when you're building the works cited page, the first step is you have to identify the type of source that you have. So the source that you use, is it a book? Is it a YouTube video? Is it a piece of artwork? Is it a personal interview? A newspaper article? You have to first figure out what type of source it is, because that's going to dictate how you cite it on the works cited page. And sometimes if there's like a translator, an editor, or multiple authors, there's like certain ways you got to format that. So I did put a link there in this week's module for Purdue University's OWL MLA style formatting guide. So this is the number one resource I would use, and I still use it to this day for you to help you cite your sources on the works cited page. So when you get to that website, on the left-hand corner, there's a whole menu of different MLA style um, formatting aspects, but this is what you will look at just for the works cited page. So it's in groups. If it's a book, periodical, electronic source, or other common sources. Other common sources is like a painting or a photograph, a concert, a conference, right? So depending on the source, right, click the whatever type of source you feel it is, right? Click that link. So let's just pretend we have maybe like an online article. So we'll click on electronic sources or web publications. So once you click on that, you're going to see a whole bunch of options pop up, right? So just scroll till you figure out which one it is. So it could be, is it a page on a website, right? And as you can see here, it shows an example of how to cite it there. If it's a YouTube video, there's a certain way to cite it. There's examples there too. The second step, after you figured out what type of source it is and you locate it on that online style guide, you have to gather the citation information. So who are the authors, what's the title, date of publication, publisher. If it's an online article from a scholarly journal, you must find the volume number, the issue number, page numbers if applicable, right? um, so those pieces of information, you will need all of it. And then you must write the citation correctly. So I copied exactly what that MLA style guide shows. Like for example, if you are to put the last name first, then comma, then the first name period, you have to follow that exactly. And then I have, this is our textbook. So then I have the textbook title in italics, period. Then it's a fifth edition, so I have to include that. So I put fifth ed dot comma, then the full publisher name, comma, the year it was published, period. So you have to follow exactly the formatting that's shown there. So you might be wondering, okay, why am I using italics or quotes for certain titles? So here's the difference between titles that are in italics and in quotations. So italicize larger works, or works that are like a container that contains smaller works. The quotations are for titles of smaller works or works that go into a larger container. So here's an example. We have Beyonce's album Lemonade. That's the container. So the album name is a container, so it's italicized, but a specific song from that album formation will be in quotes. We have title of an episode, chapter 1, Welcome to the Hellfire Club. The container it belongs to is the show Stranger Things, so Stranger Things will be italicized. Just like the argument chapter, argument is a chapter from a larger container, which is our textbook, so the textbook title is italicized. And if we have this poem from Emily Dickinson, the poem is in quotes, but it came from a larger container, which is the Norton Anthology of Poetry book. So here's an example of a works cited page that I did a couple years ago. So you have the works cited page titled at the top, everything's double spaced. Sources are listed in alphabetical order, right, based on last name. And notice that there's a mixture of different sources here: personal interviews, right, conferences, seminars, and online articles or web pages, and then scholarly articles. So some final tips, right? When you're integrating sources, ask yourself, did I frame my quote or summary? Again, paraphrases, you don't always need it, but good practice maybe just to do it all around, right? It never hurts. Ask yourself if you're making it clear what ideas are yours and what are not yours, right? By giving credit to the appropriate source. Did you give credit in text and on the works cited page? And did you use MLA style? So another thing to note here too is you cannot have a paper that is more quotes, paraphrases, and summaries than your own analysis or your own words, right? Your own words, your own ideas, right? They should be more than what other people say. So again, you could find a source and maybe you want to quote someone, but the quote shouldn't be like half the page, right? Because you just take the best bits out, right? Let's say even if you do a personal interview, you're not giving a whole page of what this person said, right? Because you are the writer. You're not giving us a report on what other people say, because I could just go on Wikipedia. Wikipedia does the same thing. It just gathers a bunch of information from sources and puts it together. But I'm not trying to read a Wikipedia page, right? I'm trying to read what you as the writer have to say. So remember, don't let the sources overtake or overwhelm your own paper. Because we're not looking for a collection of what other people say. We are looking for what you have to say.